long is this session?
Mark, I think you were cut off. Sorry.
Is this 1 hour or 1.5 hours?
1.5.
We have, I believe, 1.5. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think I see that we actually have begun the recording, Leilani. If not, please go ahead and we'll get started. So first, let me mention that unfortunately Lou cannot be with us. He had a conflict associated with some travel. So we're going to kick it off directly. I'll just say really just a minute of background or so before we turn to the lead speaker, Mark Sobel. First, thanks very much for being here, and those of you who have interest in this. It's probably quite a different topic than we usually see here in FMG, but I think a very, very important one, and that's the intersection of currency and exchange rate issues with trade policy and trade agreements. This is interesting kind of intellectually and from an economic and legal perspective, but it also has had in recent years, and here I mean not only recently since, say, the Trump administration, but as I think Mark will tell us, going back at least into the 90s, and I think even into the 1980s. So there's a practical, important and practical trade policy perspective to this that goes back some time, particularly in the United States, but I think not only in the United States. So that's, of course, the angle from which I think is going to be most interesting for most of you here. But I think we also need to understand, we need to begin with something of an understanding of the nature of exchange rates and where else these are dealt with and how they're dealt with by finance officials in particular. And it's for that reason that we're, I think, very, very fortunate to have with us Mark Sobel. This morning, Mark is the U.S. chairman of OMFIF, which is an independent think tank for central banking and economic policy. His bio was circulated. Mark was earlier in his career a senior career official at the U.S. Treasury, dealing with exactly these sorts of issues and dealing with also the United States role in the International Monetary Fund and other international institutions. And then was also the U.S. executive director on the IMF board for some time as well, up until, I don't know exactly, Mark will tell us, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. As discussants, we have Petros Mavroidis in particular from the WTO legal side. He's a perfect person to be discussing these issues. And we have also two others from FMG. We're very fortunate, I think, with both Hector and Jonathan as FMG members, and having obvious trade policy expertise. But both are also former executive directors on the executive board of the International Monetary Fund. So perfectly situated to discuss these sorts of things. And with that, Mark, why don't I turn it over to you? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Great privilege to be here. So, Brad, you asked me to discuss 3 topics: the dollar's current situation and how this relates to macro and financial policies. Second, my experiences with past currency tensions domestically and internationally and the relation to trade policy. And third, how these tensions have been addressed. So I'm not a WTO expert or a trade policy expert. I'll share with you a lot of the perspectives I had historically. First, you asked me about the dollar's current situation. I always say that delving into currencies can be a fool's errand, but I just wanted to say that the dollar now is very strong. This is a less good chart, but it goes way back. And what it tells you is that the dollar was super strong around the pause period. In 2002, there was another peak, and right now it's strong again. This is a better chart. The Fed index. And basically, what's happening now is a dollar story. Our fiscal deficits are extremely high. This lowers our national saving. It put upward pressure on rates. The Fed had been aggressively raising rates. As you know, U.S. inflation woes are increasingly in the rearview mirror. Labor markets are slowing. The Fed just cut. The dollar has eased a bit, but it's still very strong. You know, in currency markets, it takes two to tango. Others offer little to crow about. The euro area's economy is stagnant. The Eurozone isn't as dynamic as the US. The ECB is cutting rates, so that limits the narrowing in differentials. China faces its massive headwinds. We trade heavily with Canada and Mexico. AMLO's moves are hurting the peso, which was quite high a bit ago on the carry trade. Canada's cutting rates too and is impacted by lower oil prices. And meanwhile, the yen is swimming against the tide a bit. Inflation is up. The BOJ is reducing its accommodation, and spreads versus the dollar are narrowing. So, as I said, fool's errand, but on balance, there are reasons for the dollar perhaps to soften a bit, but it's still a relatively good performer in what some call in the foreign exchange market the least ugly contest. From a U.S. policymaker standpoint, if the dollar movements are orderly, nobody is going to lose sleep or pay much attention. The U.S. runs perennial current account deficits. I could go on for hours about that. I'm not going to delve into savings and investment gaps and how these are impacted by our bad fiscal policy. Just to say that on the trade balance, our huge oil deficit has gone away, but the non-oil deficit is now as big, if not bigger, as it was around 2006 relative to GDP. And I flag this because one theme that I often make is that protectionist pressures can sometimes catch up with trade deterioration with a lag. So second, you asked me about my experiences with past currency tensions and the relation to trade policy. So the earlier chart showed you how strong the dollar was in 1985 around the Plaza Accord. So Reagan cut taxes, up military spending, and the deficit swelled. Volcker carried out his crusade against inflation. Predictably, U.S. interest rates surged. The economy in the Rust Belt tanked. The dollar soared. At the time, there was also the Japan #1 narrative, and Japanese cars were gaining in the U.S. So the exchange rate was a messenger, but messengers sometimes get shot. Huge protectionist pressures arose. Treasury Secretary Baker tried to counter them with the Plaza Accord. Partly because of the dollar surge, Congress passed in 1988 the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act, and it handed Treasury the task of writing the semi-annual foreign exchange reports, analyzing whether others manipulated their currencies to gain unfair competitive trade advantage. This is something I oversaw at the staff level for many years. Not fun. So there were huge struggles around Chinese currency manipulation throughout the 2005 to 14 period, as China's current account surplus before the global financial crisis reached 10% of GDP, and reserves soared, eventually reaching $4 trillion at one point. Academic works established that China's rise created significant job losses in the U.S. Many in Congress, including Congress, argued China was manipulating its currencies. Huge pressures were exerted on the Treasury to do something. I'll come back to that in a bit. The Japanese yen always fostered controversy for us. Detroit automakers and the Michigan congressional delegation pounded on the Treasury door, complaining about currency manipulation. Even when the yen was in the 70s per dollar, Japan wasn't intervening, and Japanese auto production had shifted into the U.S. And then another Japanese episode came when Prime Minister Abe entered office with his 3 arrows program, one of which was QE. Some Abe advisors proposed that quantitative easing be conducted via foreign asset purchases. That caused an uproar, as it could be seen as tantamount to intervention to weaken the yen. Our view was that if Japan wanted to conduct QE to fight deflation, we understood, but it should do so using domestic operations. And that view was enshrined in a G7 statement in February 2013, which also noted that countries shouldn't target exchange rates. Now, amid the global financial crisis, the Fed undertook several rounds of QE. Brazil's finance minister Guido Mantega said the U.S. was engaging in currency wars. Now, this was nonsense. We were undertaking QE to support the economy, but monetary accommodation does impact the economy through several transmission channels, including the exchange rate. In any case, I've never heard a Brazilian official complain when the U.S. was growing more strongly and imported more from Brazil. Finally, global imbalances. So Germany ran perennial huge surpluses pre and post GFC. As a Euro member, it doesn't have its own currency. We felt Germany's huge current account surpluses, some 7% of GDP, unfairly took demand from others. Also, we felt that Germany's then large unit labor cost advantage relative to others in Europe, running highly restrictive fiscal policies with inflation close to zero, meant others would have to deflate even during the Euro crisis to regain competitiveness, and that was hardly in the world's interests. So Brad, third, you asked me what was done, and the answer is lots. So on the foreign exchange reports, again, Congress pressed us to find manipulation, especially for China. We didn't. Congress accused us of ineptitude and tossed the foreign exchange report into the trash can. It pursued protectionist legislation. We used the foreign exchange report to write clear and crisp criticisms of others who we felt were pursuing harmful currency practices. We beat them over the head without designating them for manipulation. And we tried to show Congress we were on top of it. I'd say other countries heard us. We failed in Congress's eyes. As an aside, many wonder why Treasury didn't designate China, even though you could argue there was a very good case. I think Hank Paulson would have answered that we were making progress through our bilateral currency diplomacy. The legislation underpinning the foreign exchange report mandated that we conduct expedited negotiations with the manipulator to fix the problem. Paulson noted that RMB appreciation would be the outcome desired of a negotiation, and that was already happening. He felt he was already negotiating because he was often on the phone with Chinese authorities and had launched the Strategic Economic Dialogue. He was concerned that if he designated China, that would make China backpedal from appreciation while unleashing protectionist legislation. Paulson also felt it was better to make the case to the Chinese that it was in their own economic self-interest to move to greater flexibility. Tim Geithner might have later additionally offered that those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. That was after the global financial crisis. So the main legislative problem with China, and certainly pre-global financial crisis, was the Schumer-Graham proposal to place a 27.5% tariff on Chinese goods. You know, we privately worked before the global financial crisis with Congress on revamping the foreign exchange report legislation to diffuse tension. We thought we were there until Congress tacked the Schumer-Graham legislation onto the draft that we had worked with Congress. So that hit the skids. On balance, new legislation was avoided. China began moving its exchange rate, partly due to external pressure. China recognized it couldn't sop up all of the liquidity it was generating through intervention, and that was having an inflationary impact. And then the global financial crisis hit, and that quieted things down for a bit. Now, Brad will be very familiar with this. In 2016, Congress passed a Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. So the act included a currency section. Congress felt Treasury had used too much discretion under the original foreign exchange report language, and thus sought to tie our hands through a more quantitative framework, looking at the same factors we always qualitatively looked at. I left government in 2018, so I won't comment here on Trump's subsequent misguided and ineffective designations of China and those of Vietnam and Switzerland for manipulation that checked the quantitative boxes. So the Vietnam and Switzerland checked the quantitative boxes. China did not at all. Our bilateral efforts were complemented by a multilateral track. When it came to speaking out against Chinese practices, our G7 European partners were not much help. They wanted Chinese FDI, the UK especially, and the ECB felt that challenging China via the IMF might have ramifications or implications for the ERM currencies. After the GFC, we pushed through G7, G20 language that reaffirmed cooperation to reduce global imbalances, move towards more market-determined exchange rates, move to flexibility to reflect fundamentals, avoid persistent misalignments, refrain from competitive devaluation, and not target exchange rates. We regarded this as a huge success. There's a long history and saga to it. Our efforts to get the IMF to play a meaningful role flopped. We naively thought that the IMF was the institution created to combat beggar thy neighbor currency policies. But anyway, I won't go through it all. Suffice it to say, the fund didn't want to get caught between the US and China. And then turning to areas near and dear to Brad's heart, one is currency provisions associated with trade agreements. So these were first needed to address congressional concerns and requirements written into Fast Track or Trade Promotion Authority as a principal negotiating objective. So TPP had provisions to create a finance group to consult on macro policy, including unfair currency practices, and to create more currency transparency, such as exchanging data on FX holdings, etc. I'd say the other TPP members highly reluctantly went along as the price for US participation. These were largely toothless window dressing provisions. They were not built into TPP itself. Now, similar provisions, very meaningless for floating currencies, were included inside USMCA. And then there was the China Phase 1 agreement. It included an exchange rate chapter. And that exchange rate chapter emphasized transparency and, frankly, G20 exchange rate agreements of the kind that I outlined before. China basically agreed to do what it was already doing. However, the chapter allowed Treasury to take China off the manipulation designation list, which Trump had placed it on when he had a fit of pique. Treasury has also emphasized foreign exchange transparency heavily. They've done so in side deals or understandings, for example, with Korea and Vietnam. This has helped diffuse domestic political pressures to some degree. Now, prior to the global financial crisis, there was draft legislation to create currency countervailing duties for currency undervaluation. So we strongly oppose this, particularly when Paulson was Secretary of the Treasury. In essence, there is no scientific way to precisely estimate undervaluation, overvaluation, or an equilibrium exchange rate. A country's undervaluation could just be the flip side of dollar overvaluation, reflecting imbalanced U.S. policies. So how would you say, well, the dollar is overvalued because of U.S. policies, but we're going to hit the country whose currency has fallen as a result? Not very sensible. Currency markets are driven by the entire balance of payments, including capital flows, not just the trade account. That gets you heavily into monetary policy, fiscal policy, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, Treasury argued very vehemently that Commerce Department had no business getting into foreign exchange or monetary policy. The Trump administration, however, rammed currency CBDs through and deployed them against Vietnamese tires. It left office before it could act on China. I wrote a stinging rebuttal to the Commerce Department proposal. It gained support from many prominent economists. Commerce has had to respond to the comments it received, but it basically just, as Larry Summers would say, they mau-mau'd us. Now, I would say also in my era, USG lawyers felt that per WTO standards, currency undervaluation was not a specific subsidy, nor was there a direct financial contribution. More generally, we didn't see the WTO having an independent role to play on exchange rates. So the IMF was responsible for that. It was up to the IMF to find if a country was manipulating its currency, and that might then lead to WTO action. But if the IMF wasn't making such a determination, we didn't see the WTO having a role. Anyway, for the reasons I mentioned, I'm not a fan of currency provisions in trade deals. Not a fan of mixing trade policy and exchange rate policy. But in any case, with respect to currency provisions and trade deals, I recognize the political inevitability of them in the US. So defanging the provisions is probably the second best option. So just to wrap up, much dollar strength was partly driven by imbalanced US policies, but that nonetheless generated domestic pressures and currency feuding. That said, foreigners too followed harmful currency practices or imbalanced domestic policies associated with export-led growth models. Trying to address these issues and keep protectionism at bay was never an easy balancing act for us. So Brad, I'm going to stop there. I thank you for inviting me today.
Mark, thanks very much. I thought that was excellent and in a very important way highlighted this important links between macro developments, macro policies, and trade, resulting in protectionist pressures. And I thought you presented in a very critical, in the best use of the term critical manner. As we turn to the discussants, we want to start first with Petros, and Petros is going to be talking a little bit about the sorts of things on which Mark just finished, which is that the WTO legal provisions, the role of the WTO in this area, given also the role of the IMF. Okay, Petros, please go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thanks much, Bradley, for including me. And I have to say, I've never heard in 15 minutes so much information, so well sequenced. It was an unbelievable intervention by Mark. Don't expect the same from me. Now, Bradley asked me to speak a bit about what can the WTO do when in presence of currency undervaluations or misalignments. So I will address two issues. The first, what does the WTO offer in terms of relief in case we observe a misalignment or undervaluation? And then how does it in the real world, and how, in my view, it should go about it, which I think is, to me, the most important issue. Now, you might remember from, this discussion starts in the WTO in, I would say, comprehensive manner because of the argument that China has intentionally undervalued the renminbi. And there was a flurry of papers. I just single out two because they are the best known papers, which posited that the currency is a countervailable subsidy. There was a critical paper by Steger and Sykes, but Steger and Sykes, unfortunately, in my view, were in the minority. Now, the first papers, they made a lot of headway. But my take is, quite frankly, there's nothing much you can do in terms of countervailing misalignments or undervaluations, because these are, by definition, assuming you call them a subsidy, they have an economic function of a subsidy, of course, generally available, which means you cannot countervail them, because according to the WTO subsidies agreement, you can only go against specific subsidies. How on earth can you prove that an undervaluation is a non-specific subsidy, even if with a very imaginative understanding of de facto specificity, is honestly beyond me. I mean, those who argue this case, they have an Everest to climb. And I haven't seen in the papers I mentioned any persuasive argument. But of course, that's not all. I mean, it's not just subsidies is not the only way you can go against it. We have Article 15, and Article 15, for all practical purposes, establishes a bridge between the WTO and the fund. And the question is, when I have a claim under Article 15 of misalignment, how does a panel in the WTO, previously the GATT, go about it? Now, what I'll show you is the two most prominent cases to make the argument that the WTO and GATT panels have served one sauce for the goose and another for the gander. There are antithetical outcomes. I'll tell you what I think, what is the best, but it's not. It's quite surprising that you'll see that the two panels came with the exact opposite outcome. I will start with the Nixon shock 1971, and I will rely a lot on a paper by a very good friend, Douglas Alexander Irwin, a professor at Dartmouth. And, you know, I was very surprised to realize that this monumental event has been totally neglected in recent literature, except for a keen eye like Doug, who realized where the problem was. So if you like the argument, all the credit goes to him and not to me. I just reproduce Doug Irwin here. Now, what happened in 1971? Well, you remember the Nixon shock. Unilaterally, he imposed a number of restrictions because defending them on macroeconomic disequilibria that the US was facing at the time. All this is fine. What we care about is what happened when this issue was discussed in the GATT. A working party is established in 1971. And following Article 15, they pass on the question to the IMF. Now, Article 15, no matter how you read it, I think, for whatever my view is worth, clearly suggests deference towards the fund for good reasons. How on earth you expect from trade panelists who are 99% of the time trade lawyers, never trained in macro issues, to decide on what is and what is not a misalignment? Mark just a moment ago said this is difficult for very experienced people because an overvaluation, as he said very correctly, could be the reason for another. I mean, how on earth can you decide those things in the GATT panel? So the question goes to the IMF. The IMF, it's my bullet point 2 after working party, says the surcharge was within the bounds of what is necessary to avoid further deterioration of the balance of payments. Now that's quite clear. You would expect the working party of the GATT to sit back and say, okay, if the IMF so says, there's nothing I should do about it. Wrong. The working party went ahead, and as my dear friend Doug explains, they call the US measure inappropriate without explaining what inappropriate means and fined against the US. Now, I wouldn't have mentioned this report very much. I mean, I understand Doug's historic interest. I learned a lot from this paper, except for one thing. This is an adopted report, so it's part of GATT acquis. So now, when we have cases concerning Article 15, well, panels, if they want to play by the book, they have to take a look at this report, which makes not much sense, in my view, at all. Now, what happened today? The other case which discussed the same issue is Dominican Republic cigarettes, 2003. That's 32 years later. Here, the panel takes the exact opposite view, which in my view is the correct understanding of Article 15. I will play by what the fund has to suggest. In this case, the panel says, whatever they say, this is exactly what I will do. They pass on the question to the fund, and the fund ends up with a recommendation, this does not qualify as a multiple currency practice, whatever. The panel clearly follows the fund, does not deviate one iota, and says, this is what they told me to do, and this is what I'm doing. If you want to read the full story, I cite here annexes C and D to the panel report. Is this now the correct way? I mean, in principle, to me, it is the correct way, but is this the way future panels will decide cases in the GATT? Quite frankly, as I say here, I hope I can say yes. But I have two, let's say, words of caution. One is there is no star decisis in the WTO. I have no idea how a future panel will decide. I've seen a number of times where panels went from black to white to gray in important issues. And the other is the appellate body, assuming resurrection, hasn't spoken on this issue so far. So we don't know what the appellate body thinks concerning the degree of deference towards the fund. My conclusion so is what I say, yes, we have turned the page, but I take it with a pinch of salt. But no matter how right I might be proved in the future or wrong, I think this is the approach to make sense, essentially for the lack of embedded expertise in the WTO. The last thing I want to say is when the 1996 agreements were discussed and concluded between WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, I was hoping to see a little bit more specificity in the agreements. Didn't happen, but I said maybe in the years following the 1996 agreements, we would see some sort of, let's say, beefing up of the content, especially in areas where we have disputes concerning undervaluations. Alas, it didn't happen. And I don't see, I think there is a lot more the WTO and the IMF can do in bridging the gap here and then beefing up the content of those agreements. And with this, I will stop, my dear Brad.
Excellent, Petros. Thank you so much, and especially the way that you ended there, which I think probably has a few of our participants already framing their questions into the area of IMF, WTO cooperation and legal provisions. We have, I think, really fortunately, we have Jonathan Freed and Hector Torres, both, as I mentioned earlier, trade experts and have worked at the WTO in depth, but also both, importantly for today, having been on the executive board at the IMF. They're both going to bring comments for us now, really in either order, but unless the two of you have a preference, why don't we start with Hector, please? But feel free to override me if you've decided otherwise.
I'm a student of Hector's, so I defer to him.
Hector, I think you might be muted. Hector, you seem to be muted.
Now? You hear me now? Okay. It was the earphone.
Perfectly.
Fine. I will start with a small comment to what Petro just last point about the WTO panel deferring to what the IMF finds. I would just warn that if that's a factual finding, there's no question about that. But if it's a finding that goes through the board, Petros, you must bear in mind that the defendant and the claimant are both sitting at the board with different voting power. So it is not that clear that what comes out from the board could be taken as a fact and not a political finding that would go one side or the other, okay? Assuming that both have different voting power. Well, anyway, so beyond that, I will try to speak about the multi-currency practices and how the IMF is dealing with that. Well, Article 8, Section 3 of the IMF Articles of Agreement prohibit a member from engaging in multi-currency practices unless it is authorized by the fund. And so when could they be authorized by the fund? So let me start by saying that multi-currency practices are used could be used with different purposes. One purpose would be to mitigate balance of payment pressures, raise fiscal revenues, case of Argentina clearly, cap domestic prices of exported goods, also used in Argentina. You depress the domestic price of a commodity to offset, at least in theory, the tariff escalation that the manufactured products faces. Allocate resources to specific sectors, and that could be specific. And the advantage is that in some countries, multi-currency practices can be adopted by executive order or central bank regulation without the hurdle of going to the Congress. So that's one thing that attracts the use of multi-currency practice. It is important to note that the fund is obliged to apply its multi-currency practice policy ex officio, without anybody complaining, ex officio. So if staff finds that a member is engaging in multi-currency practices that are not authorized, I will explain when they could be authorized, the staff must bring this breach to the attention of the executive board. Now, how does the IMF determine the existence of a multi-currency practice? The definition first. The IMF defines multi-currency practices as official action that causes exchange rate spreads to differ unreasonably from those that arise from normal commercial costs and risk of exchange transactions. Now, the IMF exercises surveillance on all its members, bilateral surveillance once a year, with few exceptions, which is in the jargon called Article 4, which could be compared with a TPR in the WTO, but a beefed up TPR, in which the staff is obliged to criticize, express views, pass judgment on whether the policies are possibly leading to a crisis or spillover effects. Well, in exercising that annual surveillance, if staff identifies an official action that could give rise to a multi-currency practice, staff must request the relevant the authorities to give relevant information to determine the effective exchange rates arising from such action and monitor whether they are within the permissible margins. Now, what is the effective exchange rate? How does the IMF staff determine that? Well, the IMF uses a midpoint, the midpoint between high and low range of market exchange rates or official exchange rates in the case of countries that impose official exchange rates. They add any additional mandatory cost or subsidies related to the exchange transaction. For instance, exchange taxes, commissions, fees, margin requirements, etc. Now, until February this year, 2024, if due to official action, the difference between the spot exchange rate is when the import is paid within the next 2 days. So if due to official action, the difference between the spot exchange rate and the effective exchange rate used for the specific transaction exceeded 2%, the member was considered to be engaging in multi-currency practices. Now, the 2% threshold is no longer used as a universal standard at the IMF since February this year to determine when a government is engaging in this multi-currency practices. The 2% tolerance margin, continues to be used, but only for spot transactions, namely, as I said, transactions that are settled in or less than 2 days. But assessing the multi-currency practices requires determining that the official action results in the actual exchange rate spread that differs unreasonably from the normal commercial cost and risk of exchange transactions. Of course, this brings the question of this no commercially reasonable difference. I mean, what is commercially reasonable in one country may be different in another country. So since 2024, February this year, determining the existence of multi-currency practices requires judgment from the staff, basically more judgment. What happens now? The question is, what happens if a member engages in multi-currency practices without the approval of the fund? Well, the country is in breach, no question about that, of its obligations under the IMF Articles of Agreement. And as soon as staff observes the impermissible spread, it should inform the authorities immediately about the breach. The country authorities will need then to decide whether they request the approval by the fund of and retain the multi-currency practices, or take the necessary steps to remove it, to eliminate it. Now, what if the member does not get the authorization or does not request the authorization and does not remove it either? Well, if the member, this is different if the member is on an IMF program or is not on an IMF program. If the member is on an IMF program and where the multi-currency practices cannot be approved under Article 8, it can request a waiver of non-observance. The waiver, of course, could be granted for a certain period or not granted. If it's not granted, and the member is not at an IMF program, if the authorization is not granted, sorry, not the waiver. If the authorization, waivers are only for IMF programs. If the authorization is not granted, and the member does not remove the multi-currency practices, the program must be suspended. If the member is not at an IMF program, and persists in not fulfilling its obligations, it could be declared ineligible. Not immediately, there's an escalation of sanctions, but eventually it could be declared ineligible to the use of fund resources. And if it further persists, the executive board, by a 70% majority, this has never happened, but theoretically it's possible, of the voting power, may suspend its rights and eventually require to withdraw the IMF. Never happened. It's just something that could be there. Of course, multi-currency practices would be also considered a breach at the WTO, and that's what we're discussing now, or not a breach, but give rise to impairment or nullification case, which maybe we want to discuss further. Now, before I close, I want to make a comment on a brief comment on the intervention, the very good intervention that Mark made at the beginning. The dollar definitely is at the center of the international financial system and the economic system. Yet the problem that we're seeing is that America is using that exorbitant privilege, as the French Giscard d'Estaing baptized it, in imposing sanctions to its foes, basically. And this creates uncertainty, but more than that, it prompts interest to use another currency, different currencies, to settle trade and to build up reserves. On top of this, we have rapid innovation in digital money, something we haven't mentioned yet, but I believe we may want to mention, that could affect the functioning of reserve currency, the dollar being the main reserve currency, and international finance, and therefore trade governance itself. Now, maybe, and this is a suggestion, that in the next meeting, we would want to discuss what the role of China and India, or the BRICS if you want, but mainly China and India, could be in transforming the international trade and monetary system to something less dependent on the US dollar. And I stop here.
So much, Hector. I contributed, I think, to the number of issues on our plate, which is great. We're going to have great discussion when we reach that stage. But first, I think we've got, we're fortunate to have Jonathan, who can speak again, both to both sides of this issue, having represented his country at both the WTO and his country and his constituency, in that case, at the IMF. Jonathan, please.
Well, thanks, Brad, first of all, for conceiving and convening this panel. Secondly, to Mark, Petros, Hector, for the very rich presentation so far. I'm going to stand back and try and bring it full circle, because ultimately we're framing this discussion about the relationship between the two institutions. So ultimately it's an architectural issue we're talking about. Mark took us back to the 1980s. I think it's worth recalling the immediate post-war period and the Bretton Woods discussions. The common diagnosis of the underlying causes of the war was that there was a combination in the 30s of competitive devaluations, exchange restrictions, and trade barriers, all of which combined to worsen, if not be, the underlying cause of the Great Depression and thus the aggression that resulted. So fundamentally, in designing the IMF, one of the fundamental purposes was stability and thus stable exchange rates. So we had even then a system that was fixed to the US dollar, which in turn was fixed to a set gold price. And the IMF was empowered with its lending authority to maintain parity among exchange rates. And that carried on through the 60s. And the misalignment that we witnessed in the 60s itself, many will not recall. Britain had a balance of payments crisis that threw things out of whack. Mark cited the consequences of the United States trying to pursue a Vietnamese war, as well as the Great Society, therefore tremendous deficits, throwing things out of whack at the time when Germany and Japan were not making their own adjustments to the US dollar shift. So that's when Nixon took the unilateral action. And in the aftermath, the world had to adjust to a world that was not one of stable and fixed exchange rates internationally, but rather an acknowledgement that there was going to be some movement, but that still what was important was orderly growth and lower inflation. In other words, some stability, but with more flexible exchange rates. And the IMF's Article 4 surveillance that Hector referred to came to the fore as being the fundamental referee as to whether each and every country was pursuing a set of macroeconomic policies, fiscal and monetary, that contributed to stable, low inflation growth and not causing major spillover effects as they adjusted their respective domestic policies. So we're into a world of a choice of exchange rates. Countries are free to have fixed exchange rates, managed float, completely market-oriented floating rates, as long as their choices aren't giving rise to destabilizing conditions at home or with spillover effects. As Mark said, however, the IMF's surveillance under Article 4 for each and every country really fell short. And that's in part because there's an inherent conflict of interest, which is often debated at the IMF, between the staff, competent as they are, being confidential advisors to the country in question to say, hey, we think you should do this or do that, and on the one hand, but by publishing reports and reporting to the executive board, having to be independent referees and judgmental in public terms on the other hand. And that's difficult for staff to do. So by following the impact of the OPEC triggered oil crisis and the disruptions that flowed from that to many economies and exchange rates, ultimately in 1977, the IMF tried collectively to tighten up the surveillance. But there's another fundamental dilemma for the IMF, because there's really two very different circumstances that are being addressed when one talks about currency manipulation. On the one hand, you've got a concern that countries in the short term, be it over the next 6 months or a year or two, are trying to address volatility, uncertainty, and unpredictability on the one hand. And the other quite different characteristic is a fundamental and more permanent, stubborn misalignment. And often in our discussion about manipulation and in the fund, let alone the WTO, that's not sufficiently articulated as to which of those concerns you're getting at. So jumping ahead, again, as Mark said, if the IMF has been ineffective and inarticulate in identifying bad practices and which bad practices, the IMF had another crack at it in light of China's practices and a few others, as Mark highlighted, from the 2002 to 2005 or 6 period, in updating the surveillance decision and trying to tighten even more the criteria that the international community wanted the IMF to look at on currency misalignments, be it the short-term volatility effects or the permanently enshrined misalignment effects. That was a very heated debate. There was a fundamental difference of philosophy between, with all respect to Mark, an American view, which was that surveillance is primarily there to judge whether countries were manipulating to gain a competitive advantage. Our European friends tended to say, no, what the fund really needs to do is to warn against volatility and to encourage country to stabilize rates. So again, going back to the very beginning as to whether we're talking about stability versus volatility as the key. There were developing country views expressed at the time in 2007 as well, expressing concern that the whole system would discriminate against pegged exchange rates, which many developing countries want, because the disequilibrium would be more apparent in those cases rather than those with floating. And Mark outlined that concurrent with this very active and ongoing IMF debate, where, as we've said from the outset of this session, even the tremendously wise economists can't quite agree on what they're getting at, the succession of US legislation and negotiating objectives and commerce and even 301, which Mark didn't mention, which was used or triggered for Vietnam in 2020, was going on at the same time. So that brings you to this century, and in particular, the post-global financial crisis environment. New concerns expressed at the turn of the teens, if I can say, in 2010, 2012, about China and the renminbi, and a few others. So finally, and I think this is worth our listeners and participants going back to, Brazil in 2012 circulated a couple of discussion papers, requested and triggered a discussion in a WTO forum that's not often cited. It's the Working Group on Trade, Debt, and Finance, originally established at the turn of the century in the wake of Pascal Lamy's triggering of a much broader discussion about coherence in economic and trade policy, and coherence between the bank and the fund and the WTO, UNCTAD, and others, to have a global and comprehensive view of who should be doing what in the interests of stability and growth. The Secretariat, and Brad, I don't know if you were contributing, but the Secretariat put together a very exhaustive bibliography of literature and studies to date that's still accessible. And again, if you summarize the literature by that point, there was still this debate between volatility and fundamental misalignment as to what constitutes manipulation. And a very rich seminar was held. Brazil circulated another paper that gave its own view of WTO disciplines that may or may not be available. IMF representatives came and actively participated in that policy discussion, but it was obviously inconclusive in large measure because of Petros's observation that a good number of the participants acknowledged that the expertise, the comparative advantage, and the knowledge on these macroeconomic questions and currency rests with the IMF. And that for ambassadors and their delegations to the WTO to engage more deeply, in effect, is the wrong place with the wrong people at the table. So ultimately, there are potential, and we've seen major trade effects and distortion in competitive advantage as a result of shifting exchange rates, be they volatile or fixed in a distorted way. But as Petros highlighted, other than GATT Article 15, it's hard to squeeze it into a countervailing duty box for the reasons he outlined. So in the interest of time, since we want a half hour for discussion, let me summarize by saying, I think what our discussion and what the literature and what the evolution of the discussion, both at the IMF and the WTO, reveals is that, look, the trade impact of exchange rates is a legitimate subject for the WTO to discuss, but not to negotiate, but for its members to consider. The best approach is to recognize the respective expertise and institutional competence of the IMF and the WTO respectively, and with appropriate deference to each with their respective remits. Now, that's a broader question in reverse, because we've seen through, and Hector can certainly speak to this, through successive IMF lending programs and prescriptions and austerity measures, the IMF weighed into recommended or insisted upon trade measures without really understanding how tariffs work, how border measures work, how the impact on domestic businesses work. And the IMF, for its part, and its staff should properly show more deference to what the WTO expertise has to offer in designing their programs and lending as well. I'm going to finish by flagging, at the end of the Uruguay round, and even going back 20 years before, there was a ministerial declaration at the start in Punta del Este of the round. There was an explicit acknowledgement in 1994 that, and I'm going to quote, greater exchange rate stability based on more orderly underlying economic and financial conditions should contribute towards the expansion of trade, sustainable growth and development, and the correction of external imbalances. Ministers, however, and I'll quote again, recognize that difficulties, the origins of which lie outside the trade field, cannot be redressed through measures in the trade field alone. So where you end up is having to conclude, as Mark did at the beginning, that the IMF and the International Monetary System is falling short, and its leverage that it could otherwise have in dealing with more exchange rate stability and more action to correct imbalances. But the WTO itself, through trade policy reviews and the non-negotiating deliberative function, could be stronger amongst its members in emphasizing that trying to take tit-for-tat trade measures, some of the unilateral tariffs that Mark has referred to that Congress is urging, is actually a recipe for protectionist crossfire rather than for strengthening stability and more orderly adjustment. A wonderful speech by Pascal Lamy to open that seminar in 2012. That's still available at the WTO website as well. You know, he had long been a champion of coherence, and he emphasizes many of these same points then, which remain as true today. So let me stop there.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. I've just switched devices, so I hope everyone can still hear me okay. Sorry about that. We've had a great set of presentations, and as I look at in front of me, look at all the participants, I'm struck that we also have a lot of people out there who've contributed in this area throughout their careers, and I want to open up the floor to anybody here, but I want to point out also that among us, we have, and these are just the ones that hit my mind, Doug Irwin, who's done research into some of the issues that we're talking about, including things like the trade impact of exchange currency reforms. Jesse Cryer, who's worked on subsidy issues, of course, for the WTO, and I know is aware of issues in the WTO legal issues and U.S. domestic legal issues, perhaps around the U.S. use of countervailing duties on undervalued currencies. Alan Wolf. Alan, I believe you started your career early at the U.S. Treasury. So you've no doubt thought about some of these issues. We've got two former WTO chief economists, Patrick and Bob, who've dealt with IMF WTO cooperation in those roles. Michaela Ruta, who does the same currently from the IMF side, and is, of course, a former staff member at the WTO, where I believe he worked on that paper that Jonathan cited a few moments ago. So not to put pressure on any one of you, and not to suggest that anybody else postpone jumping in, but I wanted to mention that we do have all these people also who've thought about these issues over time. So please, let's open it up to, I see Alan first. Please, Alan, go ahead.
First, congratulations to Mark at the beginning and all the other speakers for really illuminating the subject so very well. Historical note, I was the Treasury lawyer at the Working Party on the import surcharge in 1971. And the United States position was never that it was justified in GATT terms. It wasn't. GATT says you can only use quantitative restrictions, and the U.S. had used an import surcharge, which there was, as John Jackson had written earlier in the late 60s, was increasingly looked upon with favor as the trade measure of choice, but it wasn't legal. And this has been somewhat repaired by the 1979 Declaration on Balance of Payments in the GATT and the Uruguay Round Declaration on the Balance of Payments, that you use import surcharges to be preferred to quantitative restrictions. And that's as far as the trading system has been able to contribute pretty much to what's the relationship of the WTO and GATT to balance of payments issues. It doesn't have the expertise, and Azevedo has said this publicly during the time he served. Stay out of it. But I think Jonathan is correct that the trade people have to talk about how you deal with the trade implications of currency misalignments, of imbalances. And that's a very useful contribution. The trade lawyers are not going to solve the macroeconomic problems, nor necessarily add very much. But the impact on trade, the WTO ambassadors do have something to contribute. In any event, the legal system has not proved to be terribly useful in dealing with these issues to date. And the current situation is still, although it's not entirely legal, prefer measures that are directed by not quantitative restrictions, but by price impact. That's all I have to contribute at this stage. Thank you for the discussion.
Thanks so much, Alan. Doug, welcome, and please go ahead.
Thanks, Brad, for hosting this, and thanks, Mark, for a great presentation on what I think is really a first-order important issue confronting the trading system. I agree with Petros that currency manipulation shouldn't be in the WTO. I agree with Mark that it shouldn't be in trade agreements, but it has to be somewhere, because I think when we look back at history, misaligned exchange rates and the exchange rate system are really critical to the functioning of the trading system. My research, when you go back to the Great Depression, the protectionism had a lot to do with the malfunctioning of the gold standard and the misalignment of rates then. And then the slow move to restore freer trade after World War II had to do with the lack of convertible currencies and just the time it took to get the Bretton Woods system working. And then we've seen these occasional bouts between the US and China, and then 71, obviously, where it's been very important. So then the question is, where should the authority be if we really need to do better with the international exchange rate system? And of course, the two options are the IMF and Treasury. And Marx was really interesting in terms of the IMF's response to the tensions with China in the mid-2000s, and the fact that they didn't want to comment, they didn't want to get involved in great power politics. I remember one of my mentors, Mike Musa, said the IMF was guilty of misfeasance, malfeasance, and nonfeasance in dealing with China during that period. And it's understandable from an institutional standpoint why they didn't want to do anything. But if they can't step up, then it's up to Treasury. And I think it will be very interesting to think about. And Mark was very good in talking about Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson's response at the time, saying we didn't need to be too aggressive because we're making progress. But I think in retrospect, that period from, say, 2002 to 2008 or 9, the ramp up in China's foreign exchange reserves, the fact you have the world's second or third largest country at the time with a current account surplus of 10% of GDP. And then we think, what happened with Trump? I think if more action had been taken then, we could have avoided some of the problems in the trading system a bit later. That's just a hypothesis, but it's one that I think indicates the potential stakes if we don't get the international monetary system right in terms of its implications for the trading system. At any rate, great discussion, and I look forward to hearing more comments.
Excellent. Anyone else want to jump in? Otherwise, I will maybe formulate a question for folks. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody. If I'm missing anybody, please speak up. The question that's sort of on my mind, and which I think we can, I hope people will discuss a little bit, is what do we think the next few years are going to look like? We're seeing, as Mark was indicating and suggesting, another episode of significant and sustained U.S. fiscal deficits. Actually, I'm going to pause because I see Hamid, so I can come back to that, but I don't want to use my position to begin throwing on questions if there are others. Please, Hamid, go ahead.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all for excellent presentations. And I didn't mean to interrupt your line of thought, Brad. I'm sorry, but I just refer to what was said about this conversation being about the relationship between the two organizations, and of course I take into account everything that was said about the IMF and the long story of exchange rates and how and policies and misalignments and how they affect trade. My question, and maybe it's for all the previous speakers now, in the light of new realities, and I'm also interested in what Hector said about digital currency and how the landscape is evolving. In light of all these new realities, this conversation to me sounds very similar to a lot of conversations that take place in the WTO and the trading system now about the scoping of trade conversations. We see this in all the trade ends, whether it's climate change or privacy or cybersecurity or this or that. There are so many policy areas and regulatory frameworks that are not trade, and trade negotiators and trade policy people are not equipped to handle them, but yet they have a direct effect on trade. Now, that question of scoping, what should the trade agenda be, jumps at me from this conversation now. And my question specifically is, as the WTO embarks upon reforms of hopefully of a serious and major nature, what, in the view of the speakers, should be the issues that might be considered at the WTO in the context of a WTO reform conversation? That's my specific question. And thank you so much once again for the excellent presentations. Back to you, Brad.
Thanks, Hamid. Let's take a question or comment from Bob, and then panelists, please consider Hamid's question on the WTO agenda related to this. I'm keeping in mind there already that Petros had a few hints, I think, as to what part of that response might be. Bob, please. Bob, we don't see you or hear you. At least I don't.
You must be muted.
I'm sorry about that. I was trying to turn on my camera for some reason. It would not turn on. It was stuck. Anyway, really very, very beautiful presentations. I don't think, in fact, I'm going to assign this video to one of my classes because I don't think I've ever seen such a concise and insightful presentation. I don't really have a question other than the big question, why are trade ministers being asked to solve problems that are really finance minister problems and how ineffective that is. But I do want to provide a perspective that I heard somebody who's currently a high-level appointee in the current administration, who once, when I asked him this question, why can't finance ministers deal with this, and why is it being pushed to trade ministers? The person's response was, because the president can take action on trade very quickly, and it gets people's attention. So the president can, has a lot of authority in the trade area, and then also pointed out that macro is pretty boring when it comes to politics. So I just want to put that out there, that we have this fundamental tension of what executives can do in the trade area versus what they can do in terms of political popularity in the macro area. That was my only comment. And thanks again, really, really beautiful presentations.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob. I think there's just Hamid's question on the floor for the panelists. Why don't I go ahead and add to that, if that's okay? Maybe. And then we'll do a round of panelists before it'll probably be close to time to quit. But if you're willing to look forward a few years into your crystal balls, I would appreciate hearing from the panelists in particular what they think things might look like in 1 or 2 or 3 years. I don't think this is a question about which US administration we get, because as we heard from Mark, it's partly that, I suppose, but as we heard from Mark, these are not issues on the US side. These are not issues that started with the election of Donald Trump as president. Previous administrations, and in my view, Mark made important contributions here to the Treasury and administration positions, but the executives in the US had pushed back successfully for many years against congressional initiatives and helped to channel that interest from Congress into more productive or less harmful ways. So we're going to see, I think, this issue. What's really true, I think, and it's not going to change certainly overnight, and no one on the campaign trail seems to be talking about it, is the US fiscal situation. So if we're to look at the past, in the early 80s, for example, which Mark mentioned, when large US fiscal deficits had important impacts on US trade and current account balances and promoted a lot of US protectionist sentiment, there were, of course, other things going on by other countries, Japan at that point. We're again maybe in that situation. There's also, of course, already a lot of interest in import protections, whether for perhaps legitimate national security reasons or for more conventional types of protectionist pressures. But to take a shot, if you will, if you're willing to, kind of where we might be going in the next few years, and not only in the US and elsewhere, but also I think that can link into the WTO agenda. So part of that question would also be, what can the other countries be doing about it? Or what should other countries be doing about it, maybe individually, such as through G7 and G20 and the IMF, or collectively in the WTO or elsewhere? Panelists, please jump in. I don't have a particular order.
Well, maybe go in reverse order. So Mark should have the last word. So
Great.
let me try and trigger some discussion. So you're right to finish off, if you want a prognosis, where you are, Brad, which is, look, it's not just the remarkably huge US debt and deficit situation. We've got 70 countries, middle income and lower income, in debt distress. We've got a projection for a slower growth global economy, whether it's Germany or China, and the US carrying a disproportionate burden to generate demand. So it's going to be a fragile situation, which means we're going to continue to see volatility and shifts in exchange rate. Is it manipulated? Is it permanent? That's, again, the underlying question. What that says is, again, we haven't emphasized this, but there is a need for, as Mark hinted at, further IMF reform to come to grips with these issues, and to how to exercise what has been called since the 70s firm surveillance. You highlighted, Brad, the importance of the significant caucuses, if we can say that. It should be part of the G7 and G20 agenda, and it is, in terms of monitoring and anticipating and speaking up on what needs to be done. That's obviously preferable to the US Treasury and Congress trying to do it unilaterally. Mark circulated a paper, which is worth reading, which emphasizes we're going to continue for the next several years to be in a dollar-dominated global economy, even with a bilateral renminbi settlement between Russia and China, even with a petro-yuan being an objective for trade in oil. Frankly, most global commodities, most global commerce is still US dollar or euro, and to some extent yen denominated. That's not going to change, and for the foreseeable future, and most commodities will therefore continue to be priced in US dollars. So it's an evolution worth watching, but I don't think it's imminent. Final point, to defer to others, the answer to Hamid and to you is, as part of the reform, which is being discussed in Geneva, is to strengthen the deliberative rather than negotiating function that the WTO has available. Take advantage of the working group on trade, debt, and finance, as was done by Brazil a decade ago. You have the four already. You don't need to amend the Uruguay round agreements to have that kind of deliberation on site rather than off site. The IMF and its staff have shown itself willing to come and to participate actively. Conversely, get the Washington people to invite the WTO folks to show up. That's more important than the efforts that have been made. This is just a little cynical to connect the WTO folks with ECOSOC in New York, which is a little marginal for these purposes. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, should I go next, Brad?
Yeah, please, Hector. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it is very clear that there's an inability of the multilateral institutions to act effectively right now. And in a geoeconomically fractured world as we are having now, it's very difficult to imagine that we can bring such an issue, which is so politically sensitive as exchange rates, to the WTO. I would say, having said this, there are basically two things that could be done. First of all, I would give up any kind of hope in agreeing at this time in anything that is on substance. But we could agree on process, meaning trying to launch low-key discussions, possibly at the G20 level, on seeking consensus on how to go ahead with reforms that are symmetrically between the WTO and the IMF. And symmetrically, I insist, because the same countries that at the WTO insist that they are not ready to compete on an equal footing because they are still developing, the same countries, but with different ministers at the IMF argue that they have grown up and they are ready to assume more responsibilities in the IMF. So this is just schizophrenia, and we should discuss it somewhere. I think the G20 with a low-key consensus-building exercise would be the way to go, but maybe some others. The second possibility, Hamid, which is another low-key cooperation between the IMF and the WTO, is something that we haven't done yet, which is integrating to the Article 4 missions of the IMF, WTO staff, not to discuss with central bankers very sensitive issues as what are you going to do with exchange rates, or what is the adequate threshold for you to launch an increase in interest rates, or something that are so market sensitive. But we should, I'm sure that this would be cheap way of getting the IMF to understand more what is the trade issues and how different macro policies, being fiscal and monetary, can affect competitiveness on trade and our trade of trade interests, and vice versa. I would invite IMF people to staff to the TPR discussions that we have. And I tell you this is so simple, but I remember when I was at the board, before discussing some Article 4s, the first thing my first reaction was pick up the phone, call somebody at the TPR in division in the WTO and say, what do you know about this country? Are you doing something about it? And have you read the Article 4 that we are being discussed? And you know what? The Article 4, they hadn't seen it. and they hadn't seen it. That was a shame. Despite that in the Article 4 document, it says that it was shared with the WTO with due deletions of market sensitive issues. And yes, well, they didn't arrive to the right people. So I think there's many things that can be done with no really budgetary implications, because this is just low-key stuff. And I wouldn't bring this to the General Council nor the Executive Board. This is something that could be decided right away by the Managing Director of the IMF and the Director General of the WTO. So if there are ambassadors hearing me, you could think about this and propose this. Thank you.
Thanks, Hector. I think that's a great point of emphasis. From my own experience on both sides, that sort of cooperation that you described at the end, it happens in some cases, but not probably in the majority. And I think so there's already some possibility to do that. I certainly agree that that could be better. That possibility could be better utilized. Petros, and then we'll go to Mark.
Very briefly, I mean, essentially, I would just add one point. I agree with everything Jonathan said, and a large part of what Hector said. For me, the WTO now this is a time for damage control. This is not time for root and branch reformers. So on this front that we discuss, I would advance the point that Jonathan made. I mean, deliberation, this should be the game in town now, and maybe try to complete the original 96 contract by working on the procedures of cooperation between IMF and the WTO, and I would stop it at that. That already will be good enough.
Excellent. Please, Mark.
Thank you. So 4 quick things. First of all, thanks to Jonathan for flagging my paper with Steve Kamen and summarizing it. And Hector, that responds to Hector's some points. Basically, I think if we do what's right by America, that will be good for the world. And I have my doubts about whether we're going to do that, but that's another question. A quick point, Jonathan said something about in the late 2000s that, or he intimated, if I heard correctly, that we were pushing the IMF to find manipulation. In fact, we basically, as the IMF was working through its surveillance decisions, we said, you got a good surveillance decision in 1977, just go do it. Go do ad hoc consultations with the Chinese. We didn't necessarily say find manipulation. We just said do something. And they came to us and begged us to support the 2007 surveillance decision, and repeatedly, and we finally, and they said when we assented, they said, and we'll take responsibility, we will take it on our shoulders that we proposed this, and this was our initiative. And then we got sandbagged by the world for having instigated it, and the fund staff did not stick to their deal to take responsibility for it. Brad, you asked, what's the future? I think the dollar, remains firmish, as I mentioned, because others are pursuing not great policies. The CBO projections say 6 to 7% per annum deficits over the next decade. That's horrible. But I think we can finance it. I think, as Jonathan said, there are going to be hiccups. It'll be fragile. The current account deficit remains high because we're just saving. So you think back to savings investment balances. Voila! If you have huge, massive fiscal deficits, we're going to have twin deficits. I think the big question is going to be U.S.-China problems. I see lots of problems in terms of tech and national security concerns. I don't see it as a foreign exchange problem out of the early 2000s. I think the Chinese have learned some valuable lessons from that period. They do try to be more market oriented. They try to keep an eye on their competitiveness. But I think the Chinese would fear, in any case, large depreciation of their currency because of the 2015-16 experience when there was just a massive capital outflow. So I see kind of globalization not getting better, but not deteriorating substantially. And then just a last point about how do I see the future. It's very interesting. In the Democrat regimes I worked in, the Treasury finance types played a big role in the White House, and in the Republicans, it was the trade types. And so, I think if there's a Harris presidency, they're not going to intermingle WTO and IMF. They're going to recognize that currency issues involve macroeconomics, and it's a complex issue. Trump is dismissive of the WTO, but he's much more bilateralist and aggressive. So I don't know. I think that the Trump people would bring back much more use of tariffs as perhaps as a transactional tool. I think that they will definitely bring back the currency CBDs and ramp up the 301s and all those great numbers like 232s and whatnot. But it will be a difficult period.
Great, thank you so much. Anybody want to have a final word or final question? Not seeing any. Okay, for me, this has been not only educational, but fun and great presentations all around, great discussion from the participants. Thank you for all the questions. I guess we're going to see in the coming period what this sphere of policy begins to look like. And maybe we'll come together again and talk about it some more as we go forward. But with that, if nobody else wants to jump in, thank you so much. Leilani, anything final on your side before we close up? I don't think so. I haven't done this before. Hearing none. Okay, I think we can close out. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.